right, for our summer series, we are going to do the car forms library. Today, I'm going to start with the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. I'm going to talk about the form a little bit, and I'm going to talk about the forms that are referenced in this form so that you guys are aware of them. And then we'll dive into more of the attached forms in future lessons. So we're going to kind of cover, I'll answer questions regarding this. Also, just so you know, this month we will also be covering the forms changes. So be aware of that. Every June and every December, CAR likes to really mess with our summer and our holidays, and they update the CAR forms library right in the middle of the beginning of the summer rush and Christmas time. I think the timing's horrible. I think they should swap it maybe like a March, October, but that's just me. What do I know? I'm not in charge of it. So we will be covering those updates. Probably, I feel like June's already over, but let me tell you which ones. We will probably, usually I can get my hands on those here in the next week or so. So we will probably cover those forms updates on the 18th and the 25th. They usually go into effect right around that time period. Usually right around the 25th is when those forms changes go into effect. So those 2 weeks coming up to that date, we will be covering those car forms changes. Does anybody have questions before we get started? Yes, Sadie, what's your question? You can feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like, or you can just throw it in the chat box, whatever works.
Hey, Amy, sorry, I did not know how to unmute myself because I never go on Zoom. So,
No problem.
um, I have a question. When we're looking in car forms, and when you do the drop down on the right-hand side for all forms,
Uh-huh.
you know how sometimes there's like multiple of a lot of times there's multiple of the same form. How do we know which one is the newest one? Because when you hover over it, sometimes it doesn't
Usually,
show.
when you go to that drop down, they are all the same. They're just listed a little differently, but they're supposed to be only putting in that forms library. Like once they update the residential purchase agreement. So if I go to like purchase, oops, so there's like California residential purchase agreement. There's usually another one because it usually starts with a dot. So they have it so that it magically appears at the top. Oh, this is the one with the dot. See how this one has like a little dot and then California residential purchase agreement? I think you
Yeah.
can see my screen. And then if you go down alphabetically into where it would be, it should be right in here, California residential purchase agreement. Those are the same form. They just put a dot before one of them. So when you open up that forms library, those most used forms magically appear at the very top and you don't have to search for them. So like the listing agreement and the purchase agreement are in there a couple times.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
yeah, so they're the same form.
Okay, and then lastly, when we have I have listing like a checklist already preset, not that's not the right word, a template.
Like a template. You have a template.
Yeah, do they automatically update the forms on that also?
They did not used to. So what happened was previously you have to have a template set up and it had that purchase agreement on there. You'd have to go in there and like manually update it a couple years ago, but now I've noticed that they are automatically updating it. So on your templates, like when if they release a new version of the California residential purchase agreement, when that form gets released to the car forms library, all your templates are updated. Now what's not updated are transactions already in process or already created. So if I've created a buyer transaction and we've written a couple offers, there's a purchase agreement in there. But my offers haven't gotten accepted. I'm going to go open that file again to write another offer. Double check that one because sometimes those you have to take out of your file and then re-add or create a new file, however you want to do it. But sometimes on those, if we already have like a buyer or a seller file created, it won't update the forms in that transaction file. But templates, it does.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions before we get started? Those were good questions.
I actually have a question.
Yeah.
I'm still very new to learning the whole process. How substantial these changes that are made, like if I didn't notice the change that just happened as I'm trying to like learn them, are they substantial enough that it'll actually stop the transaction or void the transaction, or is it just like something you should know that's updating and then for your follow-up ones?
Yeah, so if you've got a transaction already in process and there's a rep agreement already signed, or there's a purchase agreement already signed, or a listing agreement already signed, you don't ever have to go back and have it re-signed as far as that goes. And sometimes the changes are really substantial and noticeable. Other times they just kind of sneak them in there. You don't even realize it. So that's why I try to make it a point to cover all of those changes prior to them being released into the car forms library or right around that, because they do change the form itself. If you Most of what's covered in your listing agreement, your buyer's rep agreement, or your purchase agreement, which are your main forms, are all in that grid format. So if they change something in there, you're most likely gonna notice it as you're filling that form out. So as long as you're paying attention to that with each and every transaction, just that grid, you're probably not going to get tripped up to something that's going to void out a transaction by any means. But I would absolutely recommend um, and keep in mind too that the date on the top changes. So like on this disclosure regarding real estate agency, it tells me that the date revised was 12/24. So you want to start checking those come the end of June, mid to end of June, to see if it's the new version. It'll say 6 of 26. And that's how
Oh,
you know
okay.
it's been updated. And then you probably want to pay attention to that. If it's got the old date on there, you don't even have to worry about it. You know that form or you've gone over it before, versus those new dates, then we kind of want to pay attention to what those changes are.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that was a longer answer than necessary, but there you go. Any other questions? Alrighty, let's get started. Like I said, we're going to start with the buyer representation. The first part, June, is going to be about buyer forms. Probably June, July is going to be about buyer forms. As we dive into um, August, we'll talk more, probably late July into August, we'll talk more about the seller forms. And as always, if you guys have specific questions regarding a form, when you hop onto this training, it'll be every Thursday, 9 a.m. You can always bring those questions like, hey, Amy, I know you're not covering this today, but can we go over this real quick? I'm happy to do that. Or if you have questions during your transactions, you end up with questions. I love forms. So I'm happy to answer forms related questions anytime. It makes me happy. You should know your forms. All right, so let's dive into this. This is our buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. Um, I just want to remind everyone that this should be signed, either this or the property showing agreement, the PSRA, should be signed anytime you're going to go show properties to a client or potential client. Um, Even if it's just for the properties that you're showing that day. Up here, I live in North Idaho, in case you didn't know that. I know of a lot of agents that are not signing buyer representation agreements before they go see properties, and it breaks my little heart for them because they're working for free. There's no guarantee that these people are going to use them, and especially those of you that use like Zillow and those type of things for lead generation, or you're on the Zillow team, I highly recommend doing this because I've had a couple of agents ask me to go show properties for them for some Zillow clients that they got leads through Zillow and they're not getting agreements signed. And I can guarantee you that these clients or these people, these potential customers, we divide it differently up here, but these potential customers are using lots of different agents to see properties. So, anyways, I just wanted to remind you to make sure you get this signed. It starts with our agency disclosure form. We see this on our buyer representation agreement. We see it on the purchase agreement, and we see it again with the listing agreement. It attaches. It just talks about the way that you can be represented in a transaction. Either you could have a seller's agent representing you as the seller, you can have a buyer's agent representing you as the buyer, or you can have an agent working and representing both the buyer and the sellers. Okay. And all of those, right, you have to both the buyer and the seller, no matter how you're being represented. As an agent, you have the responsibility of diligent exercise and reasonable skill and care and performance of your duties, a duty of honest and fair dealing in good faith, and a duty to disclose known facts known to the agent materially affecting the desirability of the property. So those are both to all parties in the transaction. So no matter how you're representing somebody, those duties are to all parties in the transaction. Okay. If you represent whoever you're representing, you're also going to right here, like seller's agent under the listing agreement, seller acts for the seller only. Seller's agent is a sub-agent or a sub-agent of that agent, has the following actions to the seller: fiduciary duty of utmost care, integrity, honesty, loyalty in dealings with the seller. Both of those there. You also, that confidentiality is so super important. It's not listed there. It'll be listed someplace else, but you do have the responsibility to keep confidential information confidential. Okay. It talks about that a little bit more here in an agent representing both the buyer and the seller. Okay, because in representing both the buyer and seller, dual agent may not, without the express permission of the respective party, disclose other party confidential information, including but limited to facts relating to either the buyer or seller's financial position, motivations, bargaining position, or other personal information that may impact price, including the seller's willingness to accept a price less than the listing price or a buyer's willingness to pay a price greater than what is offered. I just sat through the most amazing ethics class. I know you're like, ethics, amazing, Amy. It was. I would like to get her in our office to teach because she was so fabulous talking about ethics and confidentiality. And, even things like talking about why the seller is selling, right? As buyer's agents, we often call up and say, hey, why is the seller selling? And the listing agent generally is happy to release that information to us. That's really confidential information because now we just learned, oh, they have to sell because of a divorce, or they have to sell because they had a job change and they're moving out of state, right? Or where they're just looking at their options of potentially downsizing, right? Maybe they're not as motivated, right? But all of that is part of that confidential information. So just kind of keep that in mind. And then it talks about seller and buyer's responsibilities, right? It's their responsibilities to read all the documents that they're presented, make sure they understand them. They have to protect their own interests. Okay, so things like that. So that's your agency disclosure form. You see that lots. It's 2 pages. The second page is just all the legal jargon that goes along with that. If you're having problems sleeping, read page 2. Then we have our buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. Again, if we look on that date, this was revised last June of 2025. Date, you're going to put buyer's names here, broker's names here. That gets the actual name of the brokerage, not you as the agent. Okay. And there's lots of different ways you can represent a buyer. We highly recommend that you always check the box for exclusive representation, which is in this is called the grid of the buyer representation agreement. A2, we like to check this box here for exclusive. What's the difference between exclusive and non-exclusive? Exclusive is it doesn't matter what house that buyer buys. They're going to pay you whatever was negotiated on this as part of that transaction, as long as they entered into contract on it during the representation period, which we'll talk about here in a second. On non-exclusive, we're only going to receive compensation if we can prove that there was agent involvement in that property. Okay. So this one is, hey, we went and saw a couple properties. Now they went and saw a couple properties with another agent and a property or two with another agent. And they decided to write on one of those properties over there. And they decided to write it with that other agent. That would be non-exclusive. They absolutely have the ability to do that. So that's why we like to check this box for exclusive. Same idea here as our listing agreements as well. Representation period, keep in mind, it's 3 months. It's not 90 days. Okay. So it can either be like you might be doing a short-term one, like, hey, just for, this next week, because we're just getting to know these buyers and they're not comfortable with the 3-month period. But the max that you can do, so you can do shorter, the max you can do is 3 months. So if today is the, let's see here, May, June 4th, we'd go July, August, September. Oops, I skipped it. September 4th. We don't have to count out 90 days. It's just 3 months. So we can go this date now to this date in 3 months. Then what you would do is you would use a modification of terms for the buyer representation agreement. It's an MT-BR form. You can extend that in the future. Okay. Any questions there, Section A?
Can you tell me, I missed that part. When you say extend it, so you not fill this paper out again, or how would you extend it?
Yeah, absolutely. So once you fill this paper out, you do not have to fill it out again. We would just do a modification of terms form, which I'll be covering probably next week. We'll talk about the modification of terms of the buyer representation agreement, and we can just extend the deadline of the expiration of this contract.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions? Alrighty. Property being acquired. That's the gray line. I almost feel like they stuck these things in the gray line for them to stand out to you. And I almost feel like it hides them more. I don't know what their intention was, but it seems like they should stand out. But anyways, this is just, hey, what types of property? So section 2 is just what kinds of properties are we buying? You want to be as vague as possible here while still being specific, if that makes sense. So, like, it defaults to single family residential. If you check this box, which seems like, oh, well, we check boxes for what we want to include, that excludes single family residence. So don't check that box. And then check maybe they might be interested in multifamily, 5 or more, right? Vacant land, whatever they're kind of looking at, might throw it in there. Or if there's the following specified properties only. So if you wanted to be really specific, you could put it in there. That's where you could throw in some addresses or whatnot. Counties here, I recommend personally. Sadie doesn't check any of those. I like to check the multifamily and vacant land just in case they change their plan and decide to do vacant land. It always defaults with the single family residential. So if we don't check any here, then if they decide to buy a duplex, they don't technically owe us any commission. So just a heads up on that. So I would at least check probably that one. Yeah. So in the counties, I like to put in there any of the counties that I'm willing to service or feel qualified to service. Okay, they might just be looking in Solano County, but you never know. Looking in Solano, they might cross over the line into Yolo County really simply, and I'm willing to represent them there. If they decide they want to go down to Contra Costa, I'm probably not going to make that drive down. I'm going to refer them to somebody else. So I don't put it in there because it's not really one of my service areas. My point here with the counties is just when I'm going over this with the buyers, I want to be able to say, hey, if you decide, I know you're looking just in Solano County or just in Sonoma County, but if you decide to purchase in any of these other areas, I can help you there too, right? I'm showing my value to them by putting it all in there. Here's my service area. And then additional description. Again, I'm having a conversation with my buyer over this form. So I like to put in here both resale or new construction because now I've made it a point to my buyer. Number one, I've specified that, hey, it's going to be both resale and new construction, but I've specified to them that, hey, in fact, you absolutely can be represented in a new construction purchase with an agent. If you're interested in new construction homes, I will go along with you and help you navigate that process as well. It's important that you take me along so that I can help you understand how that process works. And I can only represent you if, in fact, you bring me along the first time, right? So we can have that conversation up front before they go walk through the door of those new home communities without me. Okay. This brings us to the next form. So our first form that we talked about was our modification of terms form, which we will talk about in further detail in the future. This next section, C, is additional buyer preferences and priorities form. There's a form for that. I like to work through this with my buyers. Okay, it's the BIPP form. We'll be covering that or going over it in a future lesson. I like to check this box that we're going to include this because part of my buyer consultation is sitting down with that buyer, understanding specifically what it is that they want in a property. Do they want a pool? Is the yard important? What about updates, or are they willing to do some work? And all of that is going to be found. How many bedrooms and bathrooms? All that's going to be on the BIPP form. So I like that BIPP form. Properties excluded from representation. Okay, we can either fill out some line items here, or we could check for a list attached. Why would we exclude properties from representation? Most of the time we won't, but maybe they were being represented by another agent previously, and there's a list of properties they saw with that agent that for the next 60 days, if they see them with us or decide to write an offer for that other agent receives the compensation. We may want to attach that list here. They should have gotten a list from the other agent. The only way for that to be valid is for the other agent to have provided them a list, and we would just attach that list here. Or there might be something else going on. Maybe they're talking about buying their neighbor's property, but they're not sure that's really the property they want to buy. But if they're going to do that property, they're just going to work it out with the neighbor. So they may say, hey, yeah, except for this one here, because we're kind of talking details with the neighbor on that one. Okay, so you could fill in the address there. E, broker compensation. The amount of real estate commissions is not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually and may be negotiable between buyer and broker. See attached, broker compensation advisory, car form BCA. That one is also attached to this form, just like the agency disclosure was. Here's where you're going to put in the amount of compensation. Okay, you can put in a percent here. You can put in, this is and if any blank. So this means that you could put in a percentage here. I don't think it'll let me fill in anything except numbers, so I'm just going to skip that. And then you would put in a flat rate here. So maybe we want X percent plus Y flat rate. We would put those in there in those two line items. Okay, so that's line one. And you don't have to put anything in the second line. You could just fill in a percent. You could down here, or we could check this box and just do a flat rate. Maybe you're like, hey, I just work for a flat rate. I don't need a percentage. It's just going to be this. Sometimes we might want to see this come into play if they're looking, well, you could just use it for anything that you do. You guys get to determine this, but where this comes into play often is where we see where we have got buyers looking at like mobile homes or super low price points, where your normal percentage wouldn't even like cover your fees associated with the transaction. Then we might want to go to a flat rate there. So that's where we see that as much. Or you could do this box here, or a broker created compensation schedule. So maybe for price points, right? We could have this for all of our buyers. For price points, 0 to 300,000, it's a flat rate. For 300,000 to 600,000, it's a percentage, and from 600,000 to 800,000, it's less of a percentage, right? Or maybe we go back to a higher flat rate, something to that effect. You could create some sort of broker created compensation schedule, and then you could attach that to this. So you've got three options here, either a percent, and you can go percent or we just have flat rate, or we have a compensation schedule. If we receive any payment from sources outside of the buyer, that counts towards the buyer's obligation, is what E2 is outlining. And that you are not going to receive anything in excess of the amount specified up here on E1. Okay, that's the max that you can do. Now, keep in mind, you could do a modification of terms to increase or decrease that amount. Okay, so we can change that with a modification of terms. E3 is our continuation period. Okay, what does this mean? Okay, a continuation period would be if we have a 3-month or even, let's say, a week long. Let's say that our expiration period up here was only a week. They weren't comfortable with signing anything beyond a week, so we went June 4th to June 11th. And then we specified down here on E, wherever that was, that it was going to be 30 calendar days after the representation period or any extension, that continuation period. What that means is, hey, once the representation period ends, for those properties where there was broker involvement, where I went and took you to see the property, where I inquired on your behalf for more details regarding that property, not I sent you an email with the active listings that came on the market today, but I actually did some work for you. If you decide to purchase one of those properties up to 30 days after the end of this agreement, I'm still due commission. Okay, that's continuation period. Okay, so that's why we fill in something there. If we don't fill in anything here, there is no continuation. Once it ends, it ends. They could turn right back around and make an offer on a property they saw yesterday with you. And any questions there on C, D, B, C, D, or E? Or anything, really? Okay. I have a hard time going through this form without going through it in detail. I'm sorry. All right, let's see here. Continuation rights, we did that. Buyer financial and personal information. G1, time to deliver buyer personal financial information. Okay, within 5 days from the execution of this agreement. So just so you guys know, there's a form. It's called the BFPI form. The buyer, per this contract with us, is required to provide us their financial information. They've provided us a form to help with that. Just talks about like, hey, how much money do you have for a deposit? How much money do you have for your down payment? Where are those funds coming from? Are you pre-approved? Right? So it asks them all those questions. I like to walk through that with my buyers. So I like to check the form that it's attached. But even if you don't check that form, they're required to fill that out and turn it back into you. Just a heads up on that. That's not like an optional thing. They're required to provide it to you. We're making sure they have money to pay us. Okay. If they don't have sufficient funds to pay broker, we would check this box here for G2. This is why it's so important to have these questions. Does that mean they don't get represented? No, it just means that we're going to have a conversation probably with the listing agent before we go show the property of, is your seller willing to pay the buyer's broker's obligation on compensation or a portion of that. If they say, yeah, we are, then we're going to go show it. If they say, no, they're absolutely not, then we would have a conversation with our buyer about, hey, this property that you want to go see, seller's not willing to pay any portion of your compensation. You said you don't have sufficient funds to pay broker. So I'm going to let you go see that property on your own because I'm not going to represent you in the purchase of that property, right? So we would have some sort of conversation with our buyers to that effect. That's G2. And then H brings us to the end of this form, which is other terms. We just get a blank to fill things out. Well, not the end of the form, just the end of the grid. Okay. Any questions about the grid? Okay. So far we've talked about the modification of terms, the buyer's property, the BIPP. What's it stand for? The buyer's identification of preferences and priorities form. We'll cover that next week. The buyer financial information form, right? The BFPI. Okay. As we move along, here's where it goes into detail on all the items that we talked about earlier. So if we go up here to our grid, E1, okay, this is technically 2. See, 2, section 2 is the grid. So this is 2E1. And then in this second column here where it says 4B, that's where we would find information about that topic. So if we drill down here to 4B, this is where it talks about the broker right to compensation. Okay, so if we want to go into more detail on any of these things, or it's a good idea to let your buyers know that, hey, this is how you read it. This is the reference number. This is where you'll find more details on that. Okay. Let's see here. As we scroll down, we have compensation to broker. This is where it goes into that. It details out what broker involvement is. So again, broker involvement is the buyer physically entered or was shown the property by the broker. The broker showed the property to the buyer virtually. Broker submitted to seller a signed written offer from buyer. broker performed a market analysis related to the property or reviewed specific documents or disclosures with the buyer. Property was introduced to buyer by broker, or one for which the broker acted on buyer's behalf. However, merely sending the buyer a list of properties shall not be deemed broker involvement without documented action on behalf of the broker, analyzing the property for the buyer specifically, or assisting the buyer in the potential acquisition of the property, or communicating with seller or seller's agents regarding buyer's potential acquisition of the property. Okay, so just that's what broker involvement is. The continuation right, timing of compensation. Okay, that's usually paid at the close. Payment through escrow, accounting for payments to broker if broker also represents the seller. Oh, yeah, Christy, when I send this to a buyer, I'm gonna probably put in, depending on what my relationship is with them, but I'm probably gonna default to 3 months for that representation period. If it's like we haven't actually seen a property yet, there's a secondary form for that's that can be used for just a temporary agreement for the properties that you're showing. If it's like we're meeting at the property, which I don't recommend. I recommend always doing a buyer consultation first, but sometimes that happens. This one, my default's usually 3 months. If they're uncomfortable with that, and if you've gone over the buyer representation agreement with them as part of the buyer consultation, then they're usually pretty comfortable with it. If they're not, then you can just go in there and change it. But I usually default out to 3 months. We used to do like a year, but then they kiboshed that. Most people didn't even get these signed. I like to do a year, but now we're limited to 3 months. All right. If the broker represents both the buyer and the seller, the fee for compensation, right, is negotiated separately with the seller than it is with the buyer. They don't overlap. Cancellation. So you can decide to cancel this. There is a special form for that. It's the COBR form, cancellation of buyer representation. So you want to make sure you use the right form for that. But know that you can cancel it. We'll go over that form as well. Dual agency. Let's see, properties excluded from representation, conflicts with other broker, limitations on broker representation, broker authorizations and obligations. This is an important part here, this 8. Okay, this outlines the basic duties that you have to perform for this buyer. You should be going above and beyond this. You should be able to explain how you might go above and beyond some of these items. I would personally make sure you spend some time in Section 8 of the Buyer Representation Agreement, knowing what your minimum is so that you can describe that and explain your value to a potential buyer. And then talk about how you go above and beyond, because everybody has to do this. But here's what I do in addition to these items to help you find your next property, right? So we want to talk about how we can build on that. So make sure you spend some time in Section 8. Buyer's obligations, right? If people are hesitant to sign something with you, it's not, this is so I get paid. It's, hey, this form creates that agency relationship between you, the buyer, and me, the agent. It outlines what my duties are to you. In that way, if I'm not upholding my end and I'm not following through on my duties, you have the right to fire me. And it also outlines what your obligations are to me. Okay, and so here's that where it talks about you're going to operate in good faith. You're going to turn in that financial and personal information. Okay, reasonable care and other professional assistance, right? You're obligated and you agree to read all documents that I provide to you. You should seek desired assistance from appropriate professionals selected by buyers, such as those referenced in the attached buyer's investigation advisory. You're advised to read the attached buyer's investigation advisory for the list of items and other concerns that may warrant investigation by buyer or other professionals. Buyer agrees to pay for reports, investigations. For any property for which the buyer has made an offer or is considering making an offer, buyer shall notify or update broker in writing of any material issues to buyer for that property, such as but not limited to buyer's request for information, concerns regarding any subject interest or importance to buyer. There is a form for that as well that I can guarantee you almost nobody uses. I would recommend using it. That's the BMI-SP. It's the buyer material issues for the specific property form. We'll be covering that one as well. I would recommend giving them a copy of it with this form here. When they sign their buyer representation agreement, they get a blank form. I would give it to them when we do our buyer consultation. I like the form. We'll talk about it more in detail on why I like it so much. Let's see. There's also a BIPP form, which we talked about earlier. We'll cover that one in a future lesson. Incorrect, incomplete, or inaccurate information. We're not responsible for incorrect, inaccurate, incomplete information that is supplied by the buyer or from any material that issues that buyer fails to disclose in writing to broker. Attorney's fees. Management approval, dispute resolution, we go through mediation. We're not required to arbitrate between us and our buyers. If you want to arbitrate between you and your buyer, then you would include Form ARB. That's the arbitration form. Legally authorized signer, if they are signing on behalf, if they're going to do the purchase on behalf of a trust or an entity, they are supposed to provide documents to us that they have the ability to operate in a representative signature capacity disclosure on behalf of that entity, whether it's a trust, a estate, a probate, a LLC, a corporation, whatever it might be. Okay. And then entire agreement. Okay. Let's see. We talked about that. We talked about that. Down here to the bottom, if it is exclusive representation, buyers need to initial here as well, because you can't enter into another representation agreement during the exclusive time. Brokers entitled to compensation if buyer acquires property during the representation period or with or without broker involvement. Okay, remember, with or without, even if the broker also is entitled to pay. Another broker is entitled to be paid for representing buyer. Cancellation, either buyer or broker may unilaterally cancel this agreement by giving the other 30 days written notice or is otherwise specified in 2F. If within 5 days after the effective date of the cancellation, broker provides buyer a list of properties to which there are broker involvement, broker may still be entitled to compensation. You have to provide that list if the agreement is canceled, or even if it expires and there's a continuation period clause in there, you have to provide that list. So you need to keep track of what properties you did involvement for all of your buyers on what dates, take notes. If a buyer called me and said, hey, Amy, can you check into these 3 properties? I'd probably shoot them over an email or a text message. Hey, just so we're on the same page, I'm looking further into these properties for you, and I will get back to you with the information requested, just so I have some sort of paper trail that was requested. Protect yourself, get yourself paid. By signing below, this is where the buyer signs that they agree to everything in this. If they are an entity buyer, you're going to check this box here. Okay. This is where you're going to put the full entity name. So if it's like a trust, a corporation, if it's probate, enter the name of the estate, including the case number. You're going to fill whatever that is in there. And then down here on 4B, that's where you put in their names. Okay. So the buyer might be the Petard Revocable Trust, right? And then down here, it might be Amy Petard and Jeremy Petard, right? So something like that. Then down here, you're going to put the printed name of the buyer. This is where the name of the trust would actually go. And then the printed name of the legally authorized signer goes here, who's going to actually sign there. And their title would go here. So whether they are the co-trustee, whether they're the president of the company, whatever it might be, if they have a title, you're going to put it there. Okay. And then you've got broker's signatures here. This is where you're going to fill out all this information and sign here. Okay, this is where your signature is going to go right here. Okay, if there's more than one agent, there's 2 lines for agents as well. If you have more than one agent from the same firm representing the buyer, like you're on a team situation or something, we would check this box here, and we're going to include the AAAA form. That's the additional agent acknowledgement. Or if we have 2 brokers, maybe you're working with a buyer and you're in partnership with another brokerage, then the co-broker's information is on the attached additional broker acknowledgement. That's the ABA form. Okay. Let's see. We talked about the notice of broker involved properties. There's a form for that and the Cobra cancellation. So that's our buyer representation agreement. Any further questions on the BRBC form? Okay, and again, all of these forms that we highlighted that it references in this one, we will talk about next week. I'll bring them up. And it may take us next week. It may take us 2 weeks. Attached to this form, so we had the agency disclosure at the beginning. Then we have our buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. You cannot separate these out because it does reference that agency disclosure in the BRBC. It also references this buyer investigation advisory as part of the BRBC, so it's attached. It's the BIA form. Talks about property investigation, why they should do investigation, what the broker's obligations are, what their obligations are. And then it gives them a whole list of different things that they may want to investigate regarding any properties that they might be interested in. Now, keep in mind, this is not a full and complete list. There's a bunch of other things. And in fact, we have a statewide buyer and seller advisory, the SBSA, that's like 14 pages of all the different types of investigations that a buyer or seller can do with regards to a property. So they're going to sign below that they've received a copy of this advisory and they've read and understand the terms. Buyer is encouraged to read it carefully. I would personally make sure that you highlight to the buyer that they are to read all of the forms, because oftentimes we're sending things over via electronic signatures and buyers are just clicking sign, 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 sign. So I would make sure, as part of my buyer consultation, that hey, when you open that, you don't have to start signing right away. You can actually scroll through and review it. In fact, if you need, just message me if I send you something to sign. If you want the PDF, the blank PDF of it, that's not signed so that you can easily read through it, just let me know. I'm happy to provide that to you. And in fact, I may tweak my electronic signatures email that goes out to state as such that please make sure you read all documents carefully. If you need a PDF copy of this to read it before you start the signing process, please reach out to me and let me know, right? That way I'm covering myself in case that they come back and say, well, I didn't read that. That wasn't my fault. Crystal, what is the form of the full list? What's your question? I don't understand.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. The form that had the full list of inspections that are available.
Oh, yes. That's the SBSA, the Statewide Buyer and Seller Advisory, SBSA.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay. Also attached to this, which we cannot again separate out, is the broker compensation advisory. It talks about this form in the broker buyer representation agreement, the BRBC. So we want to make sure that we include this. The top section is the listing agreement. Additional compensation. Section 1 all covers the seller. Section 2 is for the buyers. So if I was going over this with their buyers, I would just say, hey, Section 1 outlines the ways that seller compensates their agent. Section 2 is what we're going to focus on, which is how I get compensated as part of the transaction. It's fully negotiable, right? Requirement for written agreements. Okay. If we have somebody that's like, oh, I'm not sure I want to sign this, that's where we can highlight why we have to do this. And then the advantages of written agreements. Buyers and their brokers benefit when the terms of the relationship and the respective duties are in writing. It establishes clear mutual expectations and help avoid misunderstandings over the buyer and broker's duties and the amount of compensation buyer's agent is to be paid. 3 is when enlisting a real estate broker to represent them, buyers agree to pay the buyer's broker when escrow closes, but the person responsible for payment may be negotiated in the transaction, right? We can negotiate that with the seller to pay the compensation on buyer's behalf. And I would make sure that you phrase it that way and not that, well, I can get paid by the seller. I would say we can work to negotiate as part of the transaction that the seller pays the compensation on your behalf to me. Okay. Buyer pays compensation pursuant to a buyer representation agreement. Seller pays the compensation. Here's the different ways that it can happen. Either the buyer pays it, the seller pays it, buyer's agent negotiates. for seller to compensate. Buyer negotiates for seller to compensate buyer's broker. Buyer's agent negotiates an agreement directly with the seller if the seller wasn't represented. Changing practices. This is here that talks about how it used to be done versus how it is done now. I would highly recommend again that we read through all of these forms, that you become familiar with them. Pick like one a week and just start reading through it until you become pretty comfortable with it. If you have questions about it, reach out to either your mentor, reach out to me. Let's get those questions answered so you feel confident on what each form is trying to communicate and how to communicate that to your clients. The next form is our possible representation of more than one buyer or seller disclosure or consent. This is attached to this form. It's attached to our listing agreement. It's attached to our purchase agreement. They're going to sign it a couple of times if they're a buyer. Just saying that, hey, like we work with multiple buyers all at the same time. And just because you're interested in a property doesn't mean I'm not going to show that property to my other buyers. And I may have listings, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to only show my buyers my. So just keep that in mind. This is a good form to go over. And then it talks about dual agency. Keep in mind too that dual agency is whether or not, like if I have the seller and Crystal has the buyer, we're with the same brokerage. So that's technically dual agency. But I like to explain it to my buyers that if I have the listing and you decide you want to write an offer on that property, I'm going to have another agent. I'm going to have you work with another agent in our office to write that offer. So there's that degree of separation. Somebody's looking out for your best interest, and I'm looking out for the best interest of my client as well. I don't like to do dual where you're representing both the buyer and the seller. That's where the most problems come in, because how do you represent the parties to your best ability when they want opposite things? I don't know. Anyways, that's just me. It talks about that. So it does talk about like brokerage dual agency. So it outlines that here, like brokerage is working with a buyer and a seller with different agents versus single agent dual agency where you have the same agent working with both parties. Offers are not necessarily confidential unless you sign an NDA form. I've had a few agents send me over an NDA form with their offer. Keep in mind, for that non-disclosure to be valid, you should send it over before you send the offer. Otherwise, I have the offer and no signed NDA form. Multiple buyers or sellers.
Hey, Amy,
Yep.
I'm sorry. The
Yep.
section right above when you were talking about dual agency,
Uh-huh.
I'm aware, like, I don't ever want to be put in a position where I'm representing the buyer and seller, but I guess I didn't really put into perspective that this contract is actually with the brokerage. Are you
Yeah.
saying that you do not represent a buyer who is buying a property from someone within your same brokerage office with a different agent?
No, I absolutely would represent a buyer as long as there's different agents from the same brokerage
Okay,
representing them.
got
Yep.
it.
I don't like doing both buyer and seller.
Yeah, that
Specific.
seems not great.
Yeah. There has been a few cases where I've done it. Like I had um like a tenant buying the property that they lived in, and they wanted my representation on their side, and then the seller wanted to hire me so that made sure to give them all the correct forms in that case, because they've been living there, they understand the property. The buyer probably knows the property better than the seller does in that case. Or like between family members, if they want to involve an agent in that process, like that might work out okay. But for the most part, I don't do dual agency where I represent both buyer and seller. I agree with you.
Okay, thank
Yep.
you.
I think that's where the lawsuits generally lie. So anyways, there we go. Multiple buyers and sellers, and then dual agency and transaction. So it just acknowledgement and consent is down here on this section too. And then they sign it. So that's your possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. And then you have your California Consumer Privacy Advisory Disclosure and Notice. Just saying that, there's certain things that are protected under the California Consumer Privacy Act advisory. And ultimately, we have no control over what information gets disseminated out, and we don't really actually fall under that. So um, that's really what that form is saying. silly form. It talks about like this might be a good time though to cover with your buyers that hey, when you purchase a property like in the state of California, your purchase price becomes public information. The names that are on title become public information. Keep in mind what you fill out on those title forms for contact information also becomes public information. So, you know, keep that in mind. We can't control like if the photos are out there of the house, like we can say that we don't want them to be after the close of escrow and they're already out there. So it's hard to pull things back on the internet that are already in existence. So some things like that, we could have a discussion with them about what becomes public knowledge or what stays out there after the close of escrow. And then that's the end of the things that you'll find on attached to your BRBC. Any questions before we wrap up today? All right. And then next week we'll be back. We'll talk about that BFPI form, the BIPP form, the BMI form, the modification of terms, the cancellation of buyer representation. We'll probably touch on the additional agent acknowledgement form. And then at some point in the next month, we'll also touch on the additional signature addendum, the ASA form for if you've got more than two parties that are going to sign. So I made that on my notes. So there you go.
Question
Thanks, everyone.
again.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have
Yep.
so many. There's so many meetings that come out all the time, like in our email as far as what days or what. Some of them are AI, some of them are just different whatever things you can opt into. I just want to make sure your meetings where you talk about car forms, are those always going to be Thursday at 9 o'clock?
Yes, through the summer, we will be meeting every Thursday at 9 o'clock. Okay.
Thank you, Amy.
All right. We'll see you next week.